All right, go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 6. We are officially going to cover 9 verses tonight, but I anticipate that most of our discussion will be through the first 4 verses. So don't let that concern you if you spend a lot more time on the first 4 verses and then just have an opportunity to kind of touch on 5 through 9 at the end of the night. If we don't get to 5 to 9 at all tonight at particular tables, we'll try to address that in the days to come. So we're going to look at verses 1 through 9. So let me begin by reading it first. This is Paul writing to the church, and remember, just to kind of reset the context for us and inform those of you who may not have been here, we're still in the section of the book that is being built out from chapter 5, verse 21, where Paul says that we are to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. But remember, if you've been here the last couple of weeks, you know that verse 21 is built out from verse 18. So really everything from 18 through 21 is a description of what the Spirit-filled life looks like. And the last part of that is submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so last week we looked how submission plays out in the context between husband and wife. And then tonight we're going to look at how that plays out in the relationship between parent and child, and then at the end of our discussion between, I guess to use modern day language, between boss and coworker, with the emphasis of that paragraph certainly being on the perspective of the worker, and how you bring that idea of submission into the workplace. But let me go ahead and read verses 1 through 9. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Let me just pause right there. One thing that I feel like I need to say as we begin this section is that obviously at the time of this writing, slavery existed. Now, the things that we have to keep in mind is that the slavery that is in place and described in the New Testament is vastly different than the slavery that our country knew in the 1800s. So Paul is not seeking to overturn slavery. He is seeking to share the gospel. And in these verses and in the other verses of the New Testament, his objective is to tell the Christian slave how he is to continue to relate to his master, whether that master is Christian or non-Christian, and then certainly to instruct the Christian master in how to be Christ-like in his dealings with his slaves. So just want to acknowledge that he was not seeking to overturn slavery, also not necessarily endorsing the system of slavery, but that was outside of his objective in the writing. Okay, let me pick back up in verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service, as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. All right, so just a few comments about the first paragraph there. In verse 2, it says, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. Now, if you go back and you look at the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, which is certainly what this is referring to, he's talking about the fifth commandment. There's been a few different ways for people to look at, well, what does it mean for it to be the first commandment with a promise? Because some people look at the second commandment. In fact, go ahead and turn in your Bible. Go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 20 if you don't mind. Just leave a piece of paper or your finger there in Ephesians 6, but it would be helpful if we saw this. Many have pointed out that the second commandment seems to include something that could easily be construed as a promise. The second commandment being, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or the earth beneath. If you look toward the motivation, the reasoning behind that command, you see there's a big paragraph of that command. Picking up in verse 5, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So some have construed that last part as a promise. That seems like God is making a promise there that if you will honor him and no others with no graven images, that he will show his steadfast love on those who keep his commandments. So if that one has a promise, then it's difficult to see the fifth commandment as being the first one with a promise. But then here's kind of the double problem with it. If you do not consider the second commandment to having a promise, then not only is the fifth commandment the first commandment with a promise, it's the only commandment with a promise. So that's probably not what Paul was talking about specifically. He probably wasn't enumerating the different commandments and saying, now this particular one is the first one that has a promise attached to it. I think it's helpful for us if we think about it in the English. Now go back to Ephesians chapter 6. In the English, I think it's helpful for us to maybe read it as if there is a comma after the word commandment. That we read, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment, comma, with a promise. As if Paul is making two different statements. He's saying this is the first commandment, and it's also a commandment with a promise. Now, is this the first commandment? The wording here is this is the primary commandment, but in the original language of the text, the definite article is not there. So it's as if Paul is saying this is a primary commandment. Now, if you've been hanging around Utica, you have heard me say something that's not specifically based on that particular understanding of this text, but definitely shows what I'm about to say. If you've been hanging around Utica, you've probably heard me say to children or about children, if you are a follower of Christ and you're under the age of 18 and you're living in your parents' household, the number one way that you demonstrate that you love the Lord is to obey your parents. I've said that many, many times. That's probably the implication that Paul is making. He's probably saying, because he's speaking to children here. It's interesting, for one, that he's having this letter written, and this letter is being read in the congregation, and the assumption is the children are in there. So they're not down at children's church. They're there in the church with their parents. Paul is talking to them in this letter, and he is saying that the primary commandment for you is that you honor your father and your mother, that you obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Verse 3, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Now keep in mind, that is part of the quotation, or at least the paraphrased version of the quotation from the Ten Commandments. Should we recognize this as Paul's guarantee that if a child obeys his parents and honors his father and mother, that he will live a long and prosperous life? Is that the point that Paul is making? How do we know that's not the point that Paul is making? Because we see lots of evidence to the contrary, right? We see kids who live a lifestyle of obedience and honoring their parents who don't live long and prosperous lives due to tragedy. So we have to remember that this commandment And the verbiage behind it was written not to any one individual, but to the nation of Israel. This is God talking to his people. And he says, in the context of that, children, if you will obey your parents, if you will honor your father and mother, it will go well with you in the land that I am giving you. I think what God is getting at from the very beginning in the revelation of his word is following his commandments leads to a society that is stable and prosperous, especially since God is the one that controls the stable and prosperous, right? So he's saying, Israel, if you want it to go well for you collectively in the land that I'm giving you, here's one of the really important things. Now, I want you to talk about that a little bit more at your groups, specifically as how that relates to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 4, but you'll get there with your groups. And then we'll have lots of good opportunities. Students, this is your time to shine, okay? Not necessarily with verses 1 through 3, but certainly we want to hear your input. We want to hear, what is it that makes it difficult to obey your parents? What is the hard part about honoring your father and your mother, and how can you grow in that? We want to hear your input on that. But I as a father, and we'll have this conversation at my house maybe later tonight, but I as a father, I want to hear what are some things that we do as parents that provoke our children to anger? Because you have the inside track on this. What's some wisdom you can share with us about some things that may lead to some anger in the home when it comes to the parental discipline and oversight? So be thinking about that. Do we have any youth that are sitting with their parents? Because this would probably be a good opportunity for them not to be sitting at the table with their parents. So if you are sitting with your parent, you have a free pass to move to a different table, because we want you to feel freedom to talk about this, okay? All right, and then the only other thing I want to say about verses 5 to 9, you can pull a lot of this out, but students, this also is applicable to your life as a student. Most of you don't have a workplace context yet, but much of this wisdom, when it talks about how to be a Christian worker, you can apply very, very well to your life as a student. So there should be lots and lots of opportunities for us to have good discussion.